of Genesis, of Unveiling Genesis. We're exploring the significance of the book of Genesis. The first lesson we looked at, what is Genesis, and we looked at also another creation story called the Enuma Elish. Anyone? So the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, it is it's over 70 tablets. So it's tablets that tell you this very detailed story. So Genesis, another interesting part about it is it's a very simple creation story. The others, they're these epics, these sagas. The Viking one, first there were the frost giants, and then Odin came along and killed them. On the Enuma Elish, it starts with, this cosmic war. These old creation stories are very detailed, and Genesis gets straight to the point. Also, creation stories, we're trying to answer as many questions as possible. Genesis really, it doesn't give you a lot. And there's a reason for that. Genesis will basically say this. Genesis is not about the how, it's about the why. So Genesis is not going to tell you exactly how everything formed. It's not going to tell you is evolution or creationism correct. Genesis is simply going to say this. There's a God who created all things from nothing, by his word. That's it. And so, yes. So for today, we're going to look at, going to focus, zero in on Genesis chapter 3. And I'm going to answer 3 questions for you. The first is, what is made good? What does it mean when something is made good? Genesis uses this language. God, saw it and it was good. What does that actually mean? Then the second thing we're going to look at is, what is the fall? What is the fall? And then lastly, what is the great unraveling? So these 3 questions I'm going to answer. What does made good mean? What does it mean? What is this good? What is the fall? And then what is the great unraveling? So let's start with what is made good. What does this mean, good? Well, many people think that God created all things perfect. But in Genesis, the Bible does not show us a perfect world in the beginning. In fact, it shows a world that's not ideal at all. A world that's actually not very, very attractive. You should say a world that just is not very appealing. And despite the lack of sin and death, this world in Genesis has limitations. First, there were limits when it came to light and darkness. There was no endless sunshine with skies that were open and clear. And then humanity had limits to their freedom. You couldn't do everything you wanted. They could only eat, as you know, from all of the they could eat from all the trees except for one within the garden. There were limitations. There's an argument that there might have even been seasons at some point in Genesis. We don't know fully when God made the seasons. So there's some theologians that say that Adam and Eve might have had seasonal limitations. They weren't getting strawberries all the time if they love strawberries. They weren't getting apples all the time. They were limited to seasons. So there are limitations in the Garden of Eden. And then not everything was happy-go-lucky and positive. In fact, there were negatives in Eden. People felt negative feelings at the creation. For example, there's loneliness in Genesis. Adam feels lonely. This is not a happy emotion. Of course, going back to Adam, Adam has the Lord. And in our minds, we think, well, if it's just Adam and God, it should be enough. But it's not. Adam is lonely. There's negative feelings in Eden. And so God has to create Eve. The other thing is, Adam needs help. Adam is limited in his strength and his ability to do what he was created for. Remember, God created human beings to have dominion over the earth, to take care of this world, to be good stewards of it. Well, Adam can't do this work alone. This is why Eve comes along. It says when it says that Eve is a helper, it doesn't mean that Eve is lower than Adam and he's the boss. It really means that Adam, he can't do it all on his own. He's limited in his strength. So the world of Genesis is far from perfect when God creates it. And furthermore, it is a world where evil is present. Evil's already in the picture from the beginning. Contrary to popular belief, evil has always been there. But the story, and the story, here's what it does. It does not tell us who created it, and it does not tell us, where evil comes from.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. Who created
it? Doesn't even tell us why God allowed it. We have this branch of theology called theodicy, and theodicy means the problem of evil. And so for centuries, theologians and philosophers even outside of theology, philosophers are discussing, where does evil come from? What is its source? And we just don't know. And so Genesis doesn't give us an explanation. Evil is there from the very beginning. It also doesn't say why the Lord allows it. The only thing that Genesis kind of tells us to do is to just acknowledge that evil is present. It's a part of life. It's a part of this world. We might not like it, but this thing is somehow with us. And despite its presence, somehow God still makes all things good.
But don't they also say that if there is no evil, you can't tell good?
Yeah.
Mirror.
Yeah, it's one of the questions of theodicy is, how do we know what's good if we don't have evil? But we really don't know. But evil is just there. It's a part of life. So this question of, well, if there is a God, why does evil exist? The Bible looks at that question and goes, tough luck. Evil is in this world. It's part of life. And you have to deal with it and accept it. Plain and simple. So again, Genesis doesn't present a world that is fair and perfect at the beginning. There is darkness, there are limits, there's loneliness, and evil is present. But still the Lord declares that everything is good. And here's what good means. Good means that everything, all things, are somehow in alignment with each other. God is in harmony with humanity and creation. Humanity is in harmony with God and the creation. Creation is in harmony with God and humanity. There is this balance in the universe, balance in all that God has made. Everything's in alignment. It sounds new agey, but that's just what it is. When we say that what was made in Genesis is good, we are saying that despite the imperfections, there's a balance. The only perfect thing in the story is God, nothing more. And for some reason, he wanted this world just as it is. Or he wanted this world this way. He creates a world intentionally that's not perfect. And he calls it good. I think the goal of God is that God doesn't want perfection. God wants harmony. God wants balance. And it tells us that this is enough for God and nothing more is needed. And from Genesis, we get this challenge. The challenge of Genesis to us is, will we cast aside our perfect world, the perfect worlds we dream of, and imagine to embrace the world that God created? Will we leave the world behind where sunlight is forever and embrace a world with darkness where not everything is seen? Will we leave behind the world that we imagine where freedom has no limits and embrace a world where certain things are not for us to have? Will we leave the world behind without a bad emotion and embrace a world with feelings that we wish were gone forever? And lastly, will we leave the worlds behind that we imagine where evil is not present and embrace a world where it is near us, it is around us without any explanation? You see, Genesis challenges us first to let go. If you want to read Genesis correctly, you have to let go of these dreams, let go of these fantasies, and embrace what's before you, trusting God when he says that is good. Yes, much can be improved, but all in Genesis is simply an alignment. There's harmony and balance in the absence of perfection. This is interesting. We think that we need perfection and then harmony and balance will come, but in Genesis, harmony and balance are there without perfection. It's interesting. So now we move on to question number 2, and that is, what is the fall? Now we're getting into the really good stuff. Yeah, or the sinister stuff. Though God has made a world where everything is in alignment, a moment comes when the harmony and the balance are disrupted. And in the Christian tradition, we call this moment the fall. And in every major religion, and also even secular traditions, one thing we all agree on with our differences is something happened in this world that knocked everything out of balance. So we call this moment the fall, and it's more than just a time when people disobey God, when people do something bad. If you remember, God wanted us to take him at his word. He wants us to take him at his word and leave behind our perfect worlds, these worlds we imagine, to take what he has made good. But somehow in Genesis, this begins to fade, and humanity becomes convinced that they can do things better, that they can make things better. In the Garden of Eden, the story talks about this serpent, which convinces Eve to go against the limits that God has set. It basically says that good is not enough. God making things good, this is not enough. And it tells Eve, it convinces her that she could have the better that she wants. She could have things better if she just eat the forbidden fruit. This idea, also another thing is, we don't know if it was an apple. Well, we don't know what it was. It just says fruit. Western European tradition says it was an apple, but it could be a pomegranate. It could be a grape. We don't know. It's just some mysterious fruit that they're not supposed to eat. Last week we talked about history and mythology in Genesis, how it's a mix of it. It's historic mythology. It has things that to take as literal and things to take as symbols. And for some, the serpent is a snake with words and phrases. It's an actual literal animal that talks. But for other Christians, it's a metaphor with a lesson for the reader. Many people argue over this history and mythology. Is it a real snake or is it a symbol? But no matter what the serpent is, both the history and mythology agree on one thing. They agree that the serpent is a mouthpiece that gives evil a voice that humanity listens to above the voice of God. And this voice starts to make humanity mistrust God. God who's given them everything. This voice says, in a way, well, God must be keeping something from you. As human beings, when we have especially those of us who have children, when you tell your children, don't do this, don't do that, or just a child in general, the child assumes that you're hiding something from them. So what Eve does is something that we see every day. God puts a limit, and Eve assumes that God is hiding something from her. And then Adam gets convinced of it as well. Here's another thing. There's this teaching in the church, that's in churches, and it's false. And it basically says, and it's meant to keep down women, and it says, well, Eve messed everything up. But you notice when she ate the fruit, nothing happened. The balance is broken. It's only until Adam gets involved. And then when Adam eats the fruit, everything falls apart. And it isn't because Adam is special, but it's because, it's Adam and Eve represent all of humanity. Man and woman together make this dumb decision. Eve gets deceived, of course, first, but Adam in the story, he helps to seal the deal. Together they ruin things for us. There's a joke in my home church, and it says that in heaven, there's going to be two long lines, one to see Jesus and one to see Adam. And to say, what in the world were you thinking? You didn't have a perfect world. You had a good world. A world similar to what we live in today, minus the sin and death. You had a world like us, and you messed it up. So the serpent, it's a voice that it gets them to mistrust God. It convinces them that God is hiding something from them. But it also convinces them that God is like Marduk and the gods in the Enuma Elish. This voice, it makes them turn from the Creator and do things that disrupt the flow of harmony and balance. And when Adam and Eve take the fruit which God puts off limits, when they both eat it together, well, despite how small, this action, it has a massive consequence. It throws everything out of alignment. It brings back the chaos. You remember it says the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters in the beginning. This was chaos. Water always represents chaos. And God brings order to that chaos. And things are good. Adam and Eve basically take us right back to the early beginning. They start to undo the order that God establishes together. Their action creates a chaos. And this chaos brings about two things that grieve the heart of God. First thing it brings about is what we call denigration, where creation stops being cared for and humanity rejects the call to bring peace and blessing like God does. Suddenly humanity, instead of living with creation and living from creation, being nourished by it, humanity abuses and misuses creation. And this is what we see when Adam and Eve mistrust God. Taking from this tree, it's not just that they're picking a fruit, this is an act of abuse of the creation. God says, don't use the tree this way, and they use it in this way. They use it in a way that ends up denigrating, abusing the creation. And why do they eat the fruit? They eat it, they misuse it. The fruit has a purpose, but they use it for their own selfish purpose. They use it so that they can have the world that they imagine, a world that's better than what God called good. They wanted a world that operated according to their wishes. So they alter things and they fall away from the harmony and balance. First thing is denigration, the abuse and misuse of the creation. And then next is that fragmentation happens. And this is where we talked about this. Humanity's like a mirror. And I'm not going to break it. I want to break it. No, we're not going to break it. But what happens in fragmentation is that humanity, remember we said, humanity's made the image and the likeness of God. The image of God means that our ability to reflect God. The likeness of God is the quality of that reflection. If I crack this mirror, it'll still reflect, but the quality of the reflection is messed up. Well, here's another example. This is us before the fall, and this is us after. It still reflects, but the image is tarnished and dull and messed up. This is what happens. You can still see yourself, but there's blemishes and spots. The quality of the reflection is off. And so fragmentation, what this means is we still keep the image of God, but we lose the likeness of God. And this is what happens when humanity eats the fruit and the fall takes place. Through breaking the limits that God sets, the limits that set for them, they lose the likeness. The quality of God's reflection becomes damaged and it becomes impaired. In the end, we're not fully as the Lord intended us to be. And one could say that fragmentation is this. Fragmentation is an abuse of ourselves. It's not that the serpent or somebody comes along and cracks the mirror of humanity. We crack the mirror, we crack ourselves. So you have first, denigration. We abuse the creation, and then we abuse ourselves in fragmentation. One last thing, questions later, so there's one last question I want to answer. And that is, what is the great unraveling? This is a term, how many of you heard of this before? Yeah. We've heard of the fall, but most Christians don't know about the great unraveling. See, there's the fall, but then there's the great unraveling that comes after it. You see, once Adam and Eve both chose to listen to the voice of evil, the Lord speaks out with this great concern for what their actions have done. In the story, the fall is more than just this one-time event. It is, as J.E. Harvey Martin says, a process that's driven by sin and death, and it keeps on going. It basically, sin and death enter the world, and the fall progresses, and things begin to fall apart. He calls this progress, this process, the great unraveling. And it's something, and if something isn't done about it, in Genesis, we see this. If something isn't, there's a sense of urgency in Genesis 3. Genesis 1 and 2 is just, peace and, serenity and balance. But then Genesis 3, there's this sense of urgency in the text. Something has to be done, something, immediately. Because if the unraveling isn't stopped, the end will be the destruction of everything. The denigration and fragmentation will continue until creation and humanity are far from what they're meant to be. See, here's the thing about it with losing the likeness of God. I use this as an example. One day, next to my home church, they cut down this forest that was there. And and when my friends and I looked, there was a huge plantation house from the Civil War. The forest grew up around it, and the plantation house is there. And so my cousins and I, we wanted to go inside. We were told no, so we started looking through the old windows. And on one of the walls was this circular frame. And we were like, what is this? Is it a painting? And someone said, well, no, this was a mirror. And during the war, when this house got attacked, the mirror got cracked. It got broken. And over time, as it sat on the wall, pieces of glass continued to fall until there's nothing left. If the great unraveling goes, eventually what happens is, we've lost the image, we've lost the likeness of God. But when the unraveling goes to a full extent, we lose the image of God. And the Bible has a word for the full loss of the image of God. It's called hell. Hell is when human beings cease to be. It's not this place where we're tormented forever. Hell is really when we cease to be, what we were created to be, when we are a shadow of ourselves, when we can no longer reflect God, when we lose that ability. What is needed to stop all of this, to stop the unraveling, is to restore the harmony and the balance. It is getting God, creation, and humanity back into alignment. And here's the thing about this alignment is, if you lose one part, everything else goes away. It's like the law in Judaism. You break one, you break all the laws. So this idea when people say, when we talk about, revival, and people say, well, if we just get right with God, it'll fix everything. Christians have found that also when revival happens, you have to get right with the world around you at the same time. This is why revivals go hand in hand with social change, actual projects and things. It's not that, once our relationship with God is done, so we get right with God and everything's fixed. Is once one is gone, all of them are gone. The alignment's like a house of cards. You take one, it all falls down. And here's some bad news. There's nothing that we can do about it. Genesis tells us, no matter what you do, you can't fix this. You broke it, It's like my son will break things, and then he'll say, I'm trying to fix it. I'm like, you can't. Somebody else has to come in from the outside to fix this. And it's the same with our world. There's nothing we can do to fix it. You can take a vegan diet. You can save all the animals. You can write amazing Bible studies. You can create unity circles. Nothing among people and world peace things. Nothing we do can fix it. Only God can fix it. And the good news is that God gives us a promise in Genesis that he will. He says the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. He says, I will bring things back into alignment. And God promises that evil will be crushed as creation and humanity are restored. He also, and this is the beautiful part, and I'm going to end on this note, even after the fragmentation, God does not say the world is bad. Nowhere does God say the world stops being good. Even after the fragmentation, the world is still good in his sight. Amen.
Amen.
So, the thing about it is we often forget how much we are like God. I'm being very careful with this. How much we take, he created us in his image. And just like when we have those moments, like when something goes wrong and says, man, I never should have did this, or we never should have done that. But then, it's expressing grief and frustration at a catastrophe. God does the same thing. We get that from him.
Right. There's a big risk. When God created man in his image, that means that man also has the desire to create things in his own image.
Yep.
You see? And so they actually did.
Yep. This is the thing. People don't realize how much of a risk God took in making things, in making us, making the universe, creating things this way. How much of a risk, because it's like, and it's funny because you not only see this point made in Genesis, you see this point made in also a lot of African creation stories. So in traditional African religion, God and humanity are far apart from each other. God is frustrated with humanity. Because the moment God creates the world good in traditional African stories, and then humanity says, well, we can make it better. So God gives them a forest, and then human beings start chopping down the wood and making houses and building fires and altering things. And eventually God gets frustrated and leaves. And the point of the story is the same as Genesis is, that it's actually a great risk for God to create what he's created.
But are we not doing that at this moment? Trying to make man out of something?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And every time we do, and it always leads to trouble.
I don't even know if we're striving for the purpose, but I think we're looking for a makeable world where we are in control because we can make it.
Yep.
That's the thought behind it.
We want to be the chief gardener in Eden. Yeah. He had communion with God. That was the thing. God walked in the cool of the day. It says God would come along and walk with Adam and also Eve. So God's been walking with Adam, and even in his walk with God, it's not enough.
Yeah. If you read that story in chapter 2, then you see that God saw that Adam needed a wife first. In verse 17, I think. And then later on, while Adam was doing the job that God gave him, he discovered during his work what his needs were. A wife. And then after that, God, in verse 23, I think, then God created Eve.
Yeah.
And then he came with the poem.
That's a good point.
So, you know, the thing is then, the fall would not have happened if mankind would continue to involve God in his work. Because
Yeah.
it says the way he decided, that is the way God respected it. So that's a lesson for us.
Yeah. One last thing, and you just reminded me of this, Ryan, thank you, is that we don't know how much time took place between the creation of humanity and the fall. So this is why Adam and Eve, it's not that they're like children who don't know what's going on. You know, it seems to indicate that it probably was a long time. So this decision they made, they knew better. They knew God. And even with all this time with God in a good world, they still mess it up.
And he blamed them for it.
Oh yeah,
He
he
said
let them
to
have it.
Adam, because you listened to your wife.